anyways, BLA for the week, make an original post for half your credit, respond to a classmate for the other half. So what muscle or muscle group do you think is most functional for your everyday living? And make sure you, when you respond to somebody, respond to someone that doesn't have the same muscle or muscle group as you. I'm much more of a quality over quantity kind of guy. So I'm not going to be sitting here like counting word by word, making sure you have, I don't know, 100 words or something like that. But make sure you have a, coherent argument. You don't need to have like, say, strict APA formatting, but if you do use outside sources, at least, do like a simple in-text citation of where you got it. For your responses, so the follow-up responses, make sure you are adding something to the conversation. Meaning, don't just say, I agree or I disagree, or don't just say rehash what the other person said. I like what you said about this and this. Go a step further and tell me the why. So it's good if you want to say you agree with something, you disagree with something, but make sure you tell me why that is. Usually a good initial post is like around that 100-word mark-ish. So think like 5 to 7 sentences roundabout. A follow-up should be in the area of at least 3 to 5 sentences. So, I mean, not asking you to, do an entire research paper here, but at least put some thought into it. Next week is your exam. What I'm going to do is I will open the exam next Friday after class, and I'll give you until Sunday to do it. Now, because this class is shorter, I'm going to extend the time you all have. So usually I give you like one full class period to do it, but I'm going to give you all an hour and 45 minutes to do your exam. It's going to be roughly, I think, 44 multiple choice questions, and then like 3 or 4 math questions. But I'll make sure to review with you next week, and I've already posted your review sheet in the announcements. That'll be on TestMoz, and you'll have all weekend to do it. So you'll be doing the exam on your own, like on your own time. And then make sure this Sunday you get in the linear and angular kinetics homework, and that is in the announcements as well. All right, any questions on any of all that stuff? All right, perfect. Let's get into this now. All right, so today we are going to focus primarily, and Friday, we're going to focus primarily on our skeletal muscles. And this is an overview of just your skeletal muscles as a whole, not really any particular focus on a given, like say, body part or anything like that, but looking at, say, the structure, function of muscles, some of the microanatomy, all that good stuff. You should know in general some of the different distinctions of muscle groups. So you should know the difference in the different pennate type muscles. So the prefixes, uni, bi, multi, pretty self-explanatory there. Pennate refers to essentially like a fan, but when you talk about a pennate muscle, you're talking about how many heads it has. So you take something like this extensor digitorum longus, that is a unipennate. It has 1 muscle belly to it. Your rectus femoris has 2. deltoid has 3. Not so worried that you know parallel and circular. Fusiform would be things like your biceps, your triceps, that kind of thing. This is where you have a muscle that has multiple heads with different attachment points. Whereas you look at a pennate muscle, it has a common attachment point. So you take biceps, for example, you have a short head and long head for the biceps. Your origin and insertion points are both different for each of the heads. Your deltoid has, granted, its origin points spread out, but its insertion point is one common insertion point. And convergent just means that you have different muscle fibers that'll function at different points in time or with different movements, but you don't have the distinction of here's the exact cutoff between one or the other. So like your pecs are the easiest one for that. You have clavicular fibers and you have sternal fibers, but there's no distinguishing barrier or geographic barrier that says, okay, here's where the sternal fibers end. This is where the clavicular fibers end. I only really know of 2 circular muscle groups, and that's at the start and end of your GI tract. Well, I guess I take that back with your eyes as well, kind of. Yeah. All right, now, as far as your microanatomy is concerned, there's a whole lot of this, but like I've been saying, this isn't an anatomy class. So I want you to know some of the stuff, but most of it you hopefully already covered in your anatomy work. The big thing that we need to focus on here are your contractile elements. So the things that actually allow us to have muscle contractions. So anything essentially related to the sliding filament theory, that's the kind of microanatomy stuff you need to know. So you should know the general composition of muscle. So your muscle belly is broken down into groups called fascicles. Your fascicles are broken down into groups of fibers. Your fibers are broken down into groups of sarcomeres. So it's like a kind of Twizzlers pull and peel, if any of you still eat those. Now, actin myosin, troponin, and tropomyosin, those all are going to make up our entire sarcomere. The other thing that's not really shown here that you also should remember is calcium. And we'll talk about that in a couple slides here when we get to the sliding filament theory. But these are the 3 contractile elements we have. And then calcium is going to be our binding molecule. I guess it's not a molecule, it's just an ion there. All right, now, you see how you have all these different mesons around each one of these muscle subgroups. So you got the epimysium, paramysium, endomysium. What exactly are these things?
They're the like surrounding layers of the different like subsections of the sarcomere.
Kind of, yeah. Michaela kind of beat you to it, albeit in the chat, but it's connective tissue. The biggest one that isn't really kind of being shown here is your fascia. But all these are your non-contractile elements of your muscle. So what I want you to remember is anything that says mesium on it as a suffix, that is going to be connective tissue surrounding some part of your muscle. This stuff moves, but it doesn't have an ability to be contracted. It can be like deformed and whatnot. Like, have you ever had a knot in a muscle, like especially like your back or something? That is from really primarily a deformation of your muscle fascia. So you go and you say you do like foam rolling, or you do some sort of trigger point release, and it doesn't feel good at all, but it helps to reshape that. All of your connective tissue around your muscle is designed to essentially keep it in place, or to make sure it stays where it's supposed to be. The consistency of, like, say, your fascia is that of kind of like a cobweb, like a much thicker cobweb. And it's a very intricate kind of like webbing design kind of thing. So it's not one continuous piece of material. It's almost like you are intertwining a whole bunch of, like, say, thread or materials to make, like you would make like a shirt or clothes, except you're not stitching it like perfectly straight. You're stitching it all hodgepodge and whatnot. Now, this is the important part. So if you don't remember anything about microanatomy, remember the sliding filament theory. This just tells us how we have a muscle contraction. In short, you have your main contractile elements being your actin and your myosin. They cross over each other. You have a muscle contraction. Hooray. Now, this is actually a really good picture to show you what an actual sarcomere looks like in a muscle fiber in general. I've had like many students in the past think that, like, say, you have a muscle fiber that's X length. So let's say a muscle fiber is this long. You have only one set of actin and myosin, or one set of contractile elements that would act on that one muscle fiber. And you don't. You have tons. And these are all in a row. So when you contract a muscle, you don't contract the whole muscle fiber at once. You're contracting segments of it as you go. This is also why you can't contract all of your muscle all at once. So percentage-wise, percentage out of 100, how much of a muscle contraction can you make on your own? So you flex your biceps. What is the most percentage of your biceps muscle that you can get to contract on your own?
Are you saying just voluntarily? contract it on your own?
Yeah.
I have probably not very much.
I mean, theoretically, you got a 1 out of 100 chance. All right. Matt says 65, so at least somebody wants to play with me here. All right, higher or lower than 65?
I'll say lower, like 40% maybe.
All right, so Eva says 10 to 15. Alexa / Lexi says, would you say 40? Brandon says 80. Brandon, why do you say 80?
I don't know, because I just feel like when you contract your bicep, I mean, I can feel it like all throughout my arm, but then like I don't know like how far up you were talking about, like how far up your bicep you're talking about to flex.
Your whole bicep.
All right, then it might be lower than 80.
So, quick side note, my sister got married last year, and her husband, I'm not going to say my brother-in-law, made like such a terrible comment to her prior to the wedding. It was, are you going to start exercising so you can fit into your wedding dress? And my sister is like 5'10", like 120 pounds. So I feel like that was like almost like the best thing he could have said, because she got really into like exercise and like bodybuilding, and now she does those like bodybuilder competition things, and he's still, stuck with his, pack of Marlboros and beer gut kind of thing. But I went to one of her competitions, and it's surprising like how much effort the men put into like flexing in front of the crowd. Like they flex so hard that you like hear them like grunting as though like they're getting a workout in just from like posing. But anyway, maximum you're going to get, so like your maximum voluntary isometric contraction, around about 80 to 85%. So well done, Brennan. Even though you doubted yourself, I didn't doubt you one bit. Probably because I already knew the answer. So where does the rest of that contraction go? So Eva, you're kind of right, because 10 to 15% is what you don't have. So how do we get the rest of it to work? Have any of you ever had a muscle cramp before? And how does that feel? When you have a muscle cramp, you have an involuntary muscle contraction, or like a spasm usually. You're talking about 90 to 95% muscle contraction there for that given muscle group. And it doesn't feel good. That's all because our muscles, regardless of like, say, your training state, are too powerful for our body to handle. So you have different things to essentially act as like a governor or a restrictor plate to prevent your muscles from hurting yourself. This is also why, like, say, like anabolic steroids can be so dangerous for you orthopedically, because you can essentially gain the amount of muscle mass it would take a normal person a year to do in roundabout like 6 to 8 weeks. Well, if you put on that much muscle that quick, you can see how easily they become much, much too strong for your body to handle. So your Golgi tendon organs are responsible for telling how much tension is on your muscles. When your muscles contract, they send signals to the Golgi tendon organ saying, okay, I'm this much contracted. That's good. When you have a cramp, your muscle is involuntarily contracting. You have no control over that. And it's contracting it greater than what it should. The only way to get to 100% is if you have something called tetanus or lockjaw. That's where you have a permanent, complete contraction of the given muscle, typically like most of your body. What's happening when you have those spasms, or if you had any of those high level contractions, is the calcium that bonds your cross bridges together doesn't leave. So every time you have a cross bridge, to hold that in place, you need calcium to kind of clamp it shut. And then when you want to relax, so your muscle relaxes, the calcium leaves, you uncross the bridge, muscle relaxes. You have a cramp or a muscle spasm, that muscle contracts and it doesn't let go. You can't just relax it and have it stop. That's because the calcium gets trapped in there. If the calcium doesn't release, you cannot relax your muscle. We'll talk a little bit more about that at the end here. Now, back to this bit here. When you contract a muscle, your muscle fibers are going to change length. It's not because they are getting longer or shorter, but it's because when you slide over the actin and myosin, they slide past each other. So instead of, say, like running into each other, they just slide over one another. So it's almost like they have a slot to fit in. That's how you can make the muscle belly shorter and still keep everything in its space. So you with me so far? Hopefully this is kind of like mostly review for you. Maybe. All right, I'm going to go back to motor units in a second, but this here is how our muscles are structured. So if you've taken, like, say, physics, or if you've done anything with, say, like any kind of electronics or circuitry, you'll know, or you'll have seen these terms before. So a series component and a parallel component just refers to how something is situated within a given environment. In terms of our muscles, you see here we have bone, tendon, bone, tendon. Everything here is the muscle itself. Now, you notice both of these, regardless of parallel or series, are elastic components. What does it mean to be elastic?
Isn't it to stretch and then return to its normal state?
Yes. So if it's elastic, you can pull it apart, it'll come back together, which is kind of nice. It would be terrible if you stretched a muscle and all of a sudden you were stuck with the muscle being that long forever. Now, the elastic, I'm sorry, not the elastic, they're all elastic. The parallel elastic component, that's our non-contractile components. This is your connective tissue. So everything that is in the parallel component, that is something that you cannot contract. Your series components are your contractile elements. And it makes sense if you think about it. Parallel means you are side by side. Series means you are all in a row. If you remember looking at the sarcomere here, you see how you have all of these cross bridges in this. They're all in one row. So that is a series component. Does that kind of make sense? So I'm not so worried that you know every single thing about this, but what I want you to remember is that your muscle and everything within the muscle is elastic. So it can stretch and return to its normal size, or compress and return to its normal size. Your parallel components do not contract. Your parallel components are your connective tissue, like your fascia and your mesium things. Your series components are the ones that can contract. These are your muscle fibers proper, or your sarcomeres. Now, I got to apologize because there should be an extra line here. But this tells us what the overall properties are of your muscle in general. Irritable, you may also see the term excitable. Hopefully that's how you spell it. I did not know that those are all synonyms for excitable. The other components we have, contractile, elastic, and then the last one here is, probably should have gone over this before I tried to have myself fill in the blanks. Oh, extensible. So these are the four basic components you have of skeletal muscle. Contractile, meaning they can contract. Elastic, they can stretch and then return to their normal form. Irritable or excitable, they can respond to stimuli, meaning if you give a muscle a stimulus, it will contract. And then extensible is just the ability to be stretched. So those are your four basic components of muscle tissue. These I would remember. Now, getting back here to motor units. Motor units are kind of complex. This is something that you'd most likely, I believe you go into much more detail in your XPhys class, which is what number is XPhys? Is that 350? 340, okay. Motor units are just how our nerves interplay with our muscle fibers. Without nerves, you have no movement. So that's a whole basic premise of everything for movement. Every motor unit is a nerve cell that attaches to one or several muscle fibers. Your motor neurons fire in order of largest to smallest, meaning that your biggest muscle fibers are the first to be used. Your smallest muscle fibers are the last to be used. And I'll give you this example. If I'm doing, say, a leg press, and let's just say we're only working on the quads doing that, I'm only getting a relatively small percentage of my quads to be worked because I only am required to use that percentage of them, regardless of how much weight I put on. If I go and start doing, say, lunges, now I have to use more of my overall quad muscles because I have to balance myself. Your stabilizer muscles, anything that keeps you balanced or is going to help hold a joint in place while another joint moves, those are going to be much smaller muscle fibers and are kind of like last to be used. So while it's not bad to be doing leg press, if you want to get the most bang for your buck, you want to do things that are going to challenge your balance because that'll get much more of your overall muscle belly working. Does that kind of make sense? This has nothing to do with resistance or like the weight you lift. Because, for example, if you look at, say, the rotator cuff muscles, very small. They require you to use a very light weight or very light resistance if you want them to work at all. You can't go and, say, be doing front raises with 40 pounds and expect, your rotator cuff to get any work. They're just too weak to be able to do that. You lift something heavy, essentially deltoids take over. You do something like 5 pounds, now deltoid says, I'm too good for this, and your rotator cuff can kick in because they will respond best to the very light weight. So your motor unit firing or activation is pretty much irrespective of the resistance you lift. It's much more of what it is you're doing, like the activity that you're doing. Does that kind of make sense? Now, you do have a couple different types of motor units. You really have grossly speaking, they're just your fine and your gross motor skills. So fine control would be, say, doing your precision-based movements. Your strength or your gross motor skills are going to do more of your power-based movements. So if you need precision, something like, say, I'm going to, use a pen. I'm not using, power to do this, right? I need much more precision to do it. Anything where you have to finely manipulate something, you're going to be using much more of your smaller motor units. This is also why I say that balance training or any kind of resistance training that requires you to have balance is going to be better because it's going to force more of these smaller motor units to fire. Now, you also see here the relative number of muscle fibers per nerve fiber. When you have that many muscle fibers per single nerve, you have to have them be big, or else you wouldn't be able to activate nearly all of them at once. So that's your motor units in a nutshell. It's just the nerves and their innervation with the muscle and how it affects movement. It's really about it. Okay. Our muscle contraction types. Largely speaking, you got two muscle fiber types. You got fast twitch and slow twitch. Type 1 fibers are your slow twitch fibers. Type 2 fibers are your fast twitch fibers. Type 1 are your basset hounds. They are built for endurance. They are not built for speed. Type 2 are your greyhounds. They are built for speed. They are not built for endurance. Now, have any of you ever eaten like turkey or chicken before? All right, and what kinds of, or how do you describe the meat color of either.
White.
And
Red. Is it red
not red.
or like a pink or something like that?
You're thinking of red meat, I think, like beef or something.
Mm.
So you have white meat and you have dark meat. Thank you, Lexi. What's the difference between the two? Other than, color. All right, dark does have more mitochondria. That is true. And yes, it is also where they're at. So, Matt, yeah, type of fiber, kind of. You're going to have all of these muscle fibers intermixed with each other. So you don't just have like, okay, here's the section for type 1 and here's for type 2 and all that. They're all intermixed. However, you will have a lot more of one kind in a given area versus another. You tend to have more fat around dark meat than you do white meat. That's why you look at boneless, skinless chicken breast is like the whitest of white meat. Well, how much flavor does that have on its own? Yeah, pretty bland. Like you dry it out, you might as well just be eating sawdust kind of thing. That's because white meat has very little fat in it. Dark meat, on the other hand, loads of fat. Well, it kind of makes sense why when you look at what the muscle fiber types are that go along with it. If something requires or is glycolytic, what is it using for fuel?
Glucose.
Glucose or glycogen, yeah. Neither of which require you to have oxygen. If I have oxygen, it helps that I have essentially a source of energy around that'll fuel that. When I do oxidative reactions, I'm primarily going to be breaking down fats. This is why dark meat is darker, because it has a higher content of fat in it. It also has a higher instance of type 1 fibers in it. White meat, on the other hand, little to no fat, much higher concentration of type 2 fibers. See how we got there? This also is a perfect example of, if you got to cannibalize somebody, which meat you're going for. You want to stay away from say legs. Those are going to be way too, the muscle is going to be way too tough. I mean, you're gonna have to really do some low and slow cooking for that. You want to go for your gut because that's your bacon. So pork belly, that's in your gut. For men, I'm going for your pecs. Men tend to hold most of their fat in their pecs and their abdomen. For women, I'm probably going for somewhere around like your hips and thighs because that's where you tend to use more or have more of your fat. But forget all of that because the crown jewel of this all is your liver. If you're going to pick one thing to eat out of another person, and that sounds terrible, but that's the kind of path we're on right now, you're going for the liver. The liver has everything you need. Stay away from the digestive system. Definitely stay away from say the brain and the spinal cord. Some nasty stuff can be in there, especially if we're like in a zombie apocalypse. Hannibal Lecter would be the first one to be turned over if he's going and eating people's brains. But your liver, that's where it's at. So now that you got that one in your mind, The main difference we have with our muscle fiber types is fatigability and the amount of power or force they can provide us. You're never going to get the same amount of power from a type 1 fiber as you would any type 2 fiber. But you'll have much more endurance with type 1 than you will with type 2. So for example, I'm assuming most all of you can probably stand. How long do you think you could stand for? Alyssa, I just saw you stand up, so I know you can do it. How long do you think you can stand for?
Maybe like a couple hours at once.
Okay. And how long do you think you could sprint for at max effort?
Definitely not that.
I hope not. Otherwise, I don't know why you'd be in school and not being a professional athlete. So dead sprint, you're looking at 10, maybe 20 seconds, roughly. Fast twitch, slow twitch. Now you can change these a little bit, but genetics is going to be the ultimate determining factor for your distribution of this. So if I start training for, say, an endurance event like a marathon, and I do marathon-based training, I'm going to shift more of my muscle fibers to type 1 and type 2A fibers, the things that are much more oxidative. If I start doing more explosive-based training, I'm going to shift more towards type 2B fibers or type 2X fibers. So the question which are more abundant is all dependent on the person. Any one of you can train to become a sprinting athlete, and any one of you can train to become an endurance athlete. However, that doesn't mean that you're going to be elite in that. You can be very good, but to be elite, it takes genetics. So I was a college baseball pitcher. Before my string of injuries, I was throwing like 88 to 92. I mean, decent, but nothing like awesome. I'd feel confident that with training, any single one of you, even if you've never touched a baseball before, could all throw 60 to 70 miles an hour. Does that mean that all of you could then become major league players? I mean, no. It's also why you only see a handful of people that can throw 100+ miles an hour. The genetic component in there gives them a much greater disposition to type 2B and type 2X fibers. This essentially means that they would not be able to be an elite endurance athlete unless they seriously devoted their lives to it. And even still, it'd be very difficult for them to do that. Does that all kind of make sense? This just shows you how your contractile speed changes with your muscle fiber type. So you can get fast twitch to reach its peak contractile ability quicker than a slow twitch fiber. Kind of makes sense. And here we go. Biggest muscle fibers are going to be the ones that are, say, first, your smallest or the last. Muscle tone. All right, now this gets back into where I was talking about earlier with, say, having like cramps and whatnot. Muscle tone refers to really how much control you have over your muscle itself, over your skeletal muscle itself. You look at, like, say, a new infant, and how much control do they have over their muscles? And how much, say, strength do they have behind that? I mean, what can a newborn do? I mean, they can lay supine and move their arms and legs. If you sit them up, they can't hold their head up on their own. So fun fact, adult humans have a roughly 1:8 head to body ratio, whereas infants have about a 1:4 head to body ratio. So relative to the rest of their body size, an infant's head is twice as heavy as an adult's head. So the more you know. Would you ever look at an infant and say, like, man, that little dude is jacked? Like, look at those killer six-pack abs. I will say, I think my kid cries enough now where he is getting a six-pack from just the amount of crying he does. Never think about it, but if you're like crying, you're like actively contracting, your core. So if you think about it, just, you really want to get a good ab workout in. Everyone really needs a good cry every now and then. So, kill two stones with one bird kind of thing. Anyways, infants, very poor muscle tone. If you have a central nervous system injury, meaning you have something that has gone wrong, typically with your brainstem or your spinal cord, you think of, like, say, having a spinal cord injury, you think paralysis, right? But you also don't usually think about the actual motor neuron connections that still exist. This kind of thing here and this here are examples of muscle contractures, meaning you're essentially stuck in this flexed position. Many times you'll see people that have a mid-thoracic to low cervical injury is you'll get these types of muscle contractures, especially like with the hands and wrist, where you would get like usually a supinated or even a pronated wrist, flexed fingers, and a abducted thumb. So where you would essentially be like this or like this. And just even try it for yourself, but force your hand down and make a fist, or try to make a fist, and then see how that feels, just even holding it like this. I mean, how does that feel? I mean, that just kind of hurts my wrist just holding it there. And essentially you're stuck there. Eventually what happens is, like, the contraction gets too rough where you start, like, say, digging your nails into your skin. That's never a good thing. So the more control and strength you have of your muscle itself leads to the quality of your muscle tone. All right, and I already talked about that. Okay. major fiber types in these. Back extensor muscles. Are these going to be more fast twitch or slow twitch?
Slow twitch.
Why?
Well, they keep you upright, throughout the day, whether you're sitting or you're walking or whatever you're doing.
Yeah. These are much more built for endurance than they are for speed. How about your triceps?
Fast twitch.
Why?
I guess they could be used for like explosive situations or movements.
Yeah. So they're not going to be something that is necessarily more endurance based. I mean, I can't think of a scenario where you'd be doing a tricep or really an elbow extension based movement for endurance kind of thing. You think about, like, say, your different birds. So, say a chicken versus a duck. What's the major difference between a chicken and a duck?
One tastes better.
Well, that's your opinion. I actually raised ducks when I was a kid, so I'm not allowed to eat it. Otherwise, I would get like thrown out of my family. But I have before, and it does taste delicious. But other than clearly, since it is dinner time, what physical traits do they have, or what's the major physical trait that's different when they're, both alive?
The way they move, like the way they run.
Kind of. What do ducks do that chickens don't?
Fly.
There we go. So you look at the muscles that would typically allow a bird to fly, and those tend to be on or around the breast. Well, what color meat is chicken breast?
White.
There you go. And then what color meat would you venture to say is duck breast?
Probably brown.
Yeah, it's dark meat. And that's all because when you're flying is not an explosive movement, because a duck's not flying, down the street. They're flying to a different country kind of thing. So they need quite a bit of endurance. Triceps is going to be something that is going to require much more explosive based movements when you do it. And by explosive, it doesn't mean like, say, you have to do a sprint or something, but just that you are working in a or an anaerobic state or a non-oxidative state. This doesn't mean that there's not any type 1 fibers there, but you would have a lower concentration of them typically for that. And then how about soleus?
Probably type 1.
Why?
Because it's used for more stabilization and walking. So you need to stand and stuff.
What happens if you're Usain Bolt?
Can you train the type 2 fibers in your soleus?
Yeah, I mean, they're definitely going to
I
activate.
don't know. Active in your
Not quite clear cut though, is it? Because this is where you get into the true it depends. For most everyone that is a non-athlete, soleus will have much more type 1 fibers. Depending on what kind of athlete you are, if you are, you'll grossly change the composition of that. All right, our muscle contraction types. We have two categories of muscle contractions. And we have a subset of these two. So if I have a contraction with no movement, what is that?
Isometric.
Yes. So isometric is contraction without movement. If I move, so if my muscle moves, that is called an isotonic contraction. Isotonic is broken down into two subcategories. Contraction with shortening is called what?
Concentric.
Yep. And contraction with lengthening?
Eccentric.
Yes. Very good. What this means for concentric is the force you produce is greater than the resistance you are opposing. For eccentric, the force you produce is less than the resistance. For isometric, the force you produce is equal to resistance. You may also see the term isokinetic. That means that you have a unified or a steady state contractile speed. You typically only do isokinetic contractions with exercise testing. So there's like specific machines you would use, like typically like a leg extension machine will have those where you're doing a leg extension constantly. And if I try to go faster than what my prescribed speed is, it'll automatically add more resistance to slow me down. If I slow down, it'll reduce the resistance to help speed me up. So what this means to us, all muscle contractions start out as isometric. Every single muscle contraction you have initially for a split second is isometric. You unknowingly contract your muscle before you start moving the joint. If you want to build muscle mass, working on concentric contractions is the way to go. If you want to build strength, eccentric is the way to go. Another term like for strength training with eccentric would be doing negatives. Any eccentric contraction, you got to remember, is that cross bridge being pulled apart. When it gets pulled apart, it does much more damage to the muscle fiber. It's a good thing though. That's where you get like, say, your DOMS or your delayed onset muscle soreness is when your muscle fibers get damaged. Well, that's a good thing usually because your muscle will repair itself to resist being damaged again, meaning it gets stronger. If I focus on eccentric contractions or negative based exercises, I can make myself stronger without putting on more mass. Very beneficial if you're like a weight class athlete and you don't want to put on more weight. If you want to just get bigger, concentric contractions are the way to go. One of the things that you'll talk about if you hadn't already in any of your resistance training courses is the idea of exercise tempo, meaning how fast you do the concentric phase, how fast is your amortization phase, and how fast is your eccentric phase. The longer your eccentric phase, the more it's going to focus on that slow return to your beginning state. All right, just talked about all that. Okay, these guys here. Agonist is what?
The prime mover in a movement.
Yes. Agonist is your prime mover. Antagonist, they're not showing it here, but something like, say, triceps here is your antagonist. Antagonist opposes the prime mover. Synergist assists the prime mover. And stabilizer, not showing it here, but a stabilizer is the only muscle role that doesn't directly affect the joint being moved. A stabilizer is going to stabilize the adjacent joints to allow the prime mover to move. So for example, if I am doing, say, a lat pull down, so I got my bar up here, I'm pulling down. You ever see people who do lat pull downs and they kind of like stand up almost when they do it? So what's happening there is they have a lack of stability with their muscle control. If I contract my core, it's going to help hold me in place. My core has nothing to do with my lats, shoulders, scapula, whatever. Nothing to do with it. However, when I contract my core, it holds my spine in place. It allows me to then use all my force or focus all of my effort on the shoulders and elbows. So you see how that works. Stabilizer muscles are also important for, say, balancing. So if I'm doing, like, say, a lunge, I go to do a lunge to make sure that I don't fall over. I have stabilizer muscles for my core and typically on the inside, like medial and lateral side of my, really my legs, that are going to help keep me balanced so I don't tip over. They don't directly impact the joints that are moving. They make it so that the joints that move more efficiently. You're all definitely too young to remember the old commercials for this chemical company called BASF, but their whole tagline was, "We don't make the products you buy, we make the products you buy better." Stabilizer muscles do not have anything to do with the movement at hand. They make the movement more efficient. Now, how do you tell the difference between, say, an agonist and a synergist?
Would it depend on the size of the muscle?
Somewhat. Size is one of the components of all your muscles acting together, but it's also positioning. So you look here, this is, if you're lifting a glass or whatever, and they're saying you're doing like this, right? The three muscles that they're referencing here are your killer bees: biceps, brachialis, brachioradialis. Your brachialis is your primary elbow flexor. However, why is this a synergist when you're doing elbow flexion? John, you seem to have this all down. Why do you think?
Why is it a synergist?
Yeah.
I guess it's just kind of like keeping the upper arm stable throughout the movement. Not too sure.
Well, it's not going to really keep it stable because a synergist is going to do the same movement as the prime mover.
Okay. Does it just aid it? Like if the force is, or the load's pretty heavy, would it just aid that muscle and just helping it up?
It will, but like I told you before, brachialis is your primary elbow flexor.
Okay.
So why is it that we're doing elbow flexion, but it's not an agonist?
Is it due to hand position?
What about your hand position?
That would
So,
make sense.
I mean, in that circumstance, you're in a neutral position in comparison to when it's the primary mover, it's when your hand is pronated.
Absolutely. First person to get that in like years. So, brachialis, while it is your primary elbow flexor, it is the only one of the 3B muscles that do not supinate your hand or supinate your forearm. And it's all because that this inserts onto the ulna, whereas biceps and brachioradialis all insert on the radius. The radius is the only bone that moves in pronation and supination. So if you do not move the radius, you cannot supinate your forearm. If I'm not pronated, I am in some degree of supination. So even in functional position, I am supinated. You can argue that really either one of these, biceps or brachioradialis, would be considered the agonist for this motion. But you cannot have brachialis be the agonist because you have a hand that is in neutral position, which is partially supinated. See how that works? So if I'm doing a reverse curl, hell yeah, that's all brachialis right there. But if you notice though, I don't get to show off my killer arms here, but if I do a reverse curl, whatever, but as soon as I turn over into supination, I mean, I don't got much there, but you can see how the muscle clearly moves when I go into supination here. So you're activating primarily biceps when you supinate. The whole moral of this story is to truly tell what role each muscle plays in a movement, you have to look at the whole positioning and have an understanding of the anatomy relative to that movement. So while I'm not going to test you on, say, where exactly is the origin point of the long head of your biceps, which you should know because that's your labrum, you do need to know that when you look at the practical application of it. So if you didn't know that, you wouldn't know that, say, shoulder pain can be caused by biceps tendonitis. So you see how that kind of all works? All right, I want to finish up with this, well, two things here. Now, I'll go over that one on Friday, so we're not going to get too much into it. But this last bit here is active and passive insufficiency. So I had you earlier do this whole movement here. What happens with active insufficiency is this is when you move one joint and another joint distal to it can't move nearly as well because you essentially cut off the power to it. So if you take your hand and you flex your wrist and then try to make a fist, how good of a fist can you make? Yeah, not very. And that's all because of this active insufficiency. If I start out by making a fist, I can make a good fist. If I go into then wrist flexion, I have a lot lower contractile ability of my hand because when my wrist is flexed, I have an inability to provide efficient force to my fingers. It's all because this is flexed. When the wrist is flexed, I don't have any really leverage here. Because remember, most of your finger flexors are located in the forearm. I mean, yeah, you have your intrinsic like hand muscles. Those really aren't much for power. So if I cut off my forearm from my fingers, I can't make a fist. Now, if you have passive insufficiency, this is where you are going to essentially lose range of motion based on how far a muscle can stretch. So if I have, well, I don't have any of my rubber bands on me. Oh well. If I do this, and let's say I have a partner that is stretching me or stretching for me, as my partner keeps pushing my left leg there back, it's obviously going to put much more stress or tension on my hamstrings. But what happens if they don't stop? Like they just keep going? What's going to happen to me?
You start to like compensate.
How so?
Like your like hip will start lifting off the ground, your knee will start bending.
There you go. The hip off the ground will primarily be like the opposite hip. So while that is a compensation, but that's definitely something that happens, that doesn't show this passive insufficiency. So you're right, that definitely does happen, but the knee bending is the more appropriate answer here. So my leg lifts up. I can barely even get it to this high. If I want to keep going, I have to bend my knee. Otherwise, I'm going to be overstretched with my hamstrings. If I bend my knee all the way, I can pull this, all the way to my chest. But try to stick your leg up from here. Yeah, that ain't happening. So that there is your passive insufficiency. Active insufficiency refers to a contraction. So that's where you lose force production distally. A proximal joint movement restricts a distal joint movement. Passive insufficiency is where a proximal muscle being stretched will limit the amount of tensile strength of a distal joint. So if you were to lock my knee in place, like in full extension, and then do that, like do this to me, you would rip your hamstrings off the bone eventually. So you have to bend the knee to take the tension off of the proximal joint or muscle group. That kind of makes sense? All right. So that's about everything I wanted to cover here today. What kind of questions do you all have so far? All right, well, if you all don't have any more questions, you are all good to go. Thank you all for getting through all this with me. And then I will hopefully see you all here on Friday.
Thank you, Professor.
Okay, bye.
Thanks. Have a good one.